Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s, everyone. I'm Matt Williamson. I've got a special guest today, writer Jonathan Gould. And Jonathan wrote the very good Beatle biography, Can't Buy Me Love. Welcome, Jonathan.
Happy to be here, Matt.
Well, I was so glad to read your biography. It was one that I hadn't read, right away. I had come across it about a year ago, and it had been recommended to me. And I finally read it, and I was very impressed. And one of the reasons why I was so impressed was that I know you took plenty of time you took your time writing it, but I really appreciated your musical background and what you added to the story because of your musical background.
Well, when I started writing it, it took me a very long time to write this book. In fact, this book was the way that I made a transition from playing music mainly to writing about music in that sense. And there was a lot to learn, and there were a lot of false starts and so on and so forth along the way. But from the very beginning, I started writing it in the 1990s. It was published in 2007, I believe. So that's a long spell. From the very beginning, though, I had read the principal biographies of the Beatles that had been written up until that time. And to me, the common denominator of them was that while they were perfectly capable biographies in a conventional sense, they really didn't deal with their music, with the band's music in a serious way or in an informed way, I guess is the best way to describe it. They tended to rely on what other people said about this record or this song and so on and so forth. And what I really wanted to do was I wanted to write about the music. And I wanted to write about the music in a descriptive manner. And so that was my initial sort of impetus. As it happened, once I got into writing the book, a very good writer in Boston named Tim Riley published a book that in some ways was quite like what I initially set out to do. He sort of went through the Beatles recordings, pretty much album by album, track by track, and wrote sort of critical essays about each of those records in that way. By that time, though, I thought, great, that's somebody else is doing it too, but I've become completely immersed in what I would describe as the social and cultural phenomenon of the Beatles, based on their music, but also based on their public image, on their personalities, and on what these millions of fans, which of course by that time were starting to turn into generations of fans, um, had done with these people, the Beatles, that is to say, the way they had incorporated them in many cases into a view of the world, or certainly a view of recent history, I guess is the best way to describe it. So one of the reasons my book took as long as it did to write was that having set out to do this one thing, which I felt hadn't been done, I then got completely involved in doing this other thing as well. And to say one more thing about it, what I discovered was that no matter what I wanted to do, I did have to write a pretty fundamental biography in the conventional sense of their lives, or at least their lives as Beatles up until the end of the band. So that became yet a third sort of dimension of the thing. And so the idea was ultimately was to combine all of these perspectives. And I have to say, when I go back and look at it now, and I've gone on to do other things, I'm pleasantly surprised for the most part by what I seem to have done back then, I guess is the way I would describe it.
Well, I would add to that, here's the book right here. It's mine is kind of beat up because I use it so much, but it's you wrote those three areas you talked about. You fit them all very economically into this volume, which I thought is where the real value of this book is. You weave them all in very well. And as far as the musical part, what's very interesting is that since the Beatles launched this musical revolution, and many of us started to play music because of the Beatles, it was strange that that was one of the things absent from the biographies starting as early as 100 Davies, really.
Sure. Yeah. It's it's notoriously hard to write about music. There are a number of well-known expressions that describe the supposed futility of writing about music, but it's kind of silly. It's hard to write about art too, or visual art. It's hard to write about Let's put it this way: it's hard to write about abstract painting, for example, and yet people do it, and they do it extremely well. The point of all of this sort of thing is it's hard to write about dance, but people do it and do it very well. Um, the point of this is it can be done. It's hard to do. You have to put a lot of effort into it. And a lot of the effort goes into what you were describing, which is the need to economize in one's writing. Most Beatles songs, for example, are, between, well, 2.5 and maybe 5 or 6 minutes long in the case of the longer ones, right? Um, you can't go on and on about a work of art that lasts for 3 minutes. You have to, whatever you're going to say about it, you have to say it in a way that somehow honors the duration of the piece that you're writing about. And so I feel one needs to be economical about it. One needs to have some of the same often kind of lightness and quickness that the music itself has when you're writing about it. And you try to mirror those characteristics in the writing. And that's really hard. What can you say? There it is.
Well, your book really has that your style of writing is light and it's easy to read and it's fun and there's some sarcasm in there, but it's a very good perspective, and economy is a good way to sum up a lot of your writing. And this was your first book, Can't Buy Me
Yeah,
Love, but you also wrote a book on Otis Redding called An Unfinished Life. That was 2017. And
right.
the other music book that we've got that's almost out is Burning Down the House, Talking Heads, and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock, which is due out, I believe, June 2025.
Absolutely. I recognize that cover.
Yeah, great cover.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's
like it.
Yeah, so very excited to read that. And this you basically became, well, you've done many things, but you were a full-time musician really for a couple of decades.
Yes, I started out that way. Indeed.
And as a drummer, I should
I'm a
say.
drummer.
Hmm.
I was and still am a drummer in that sense. And I also did some songwriting. I learned to play piano poorly enough to write songs on it, and to pick things out as far as that goes. But mainly, my whole orientation toward popular music was initially as a percussionist, as a drummer. Yeah.
Well, I want to give the an example to the audience. We talk about the efficiency of your writing. The best way to do that, I'm going to give one sentence from your book that talks about the relationship of how Pete Best didn't really fit into the Beatles,
Mm.
the band, the Beatles, his personality didn't quite fit. Let me just read this sentence here.
Sure.
Quote, he had shared in their music mainly as a sideman, in their humor mainly as a straight man, and while he was hardly unintelligent, his intelligence had no edge. That
Right.
is a beautiful way to sum him up, and it's a fair way to sum him up. And it doesn't really do him any injustice, but he just didn't jive with those guys. And I thought that was a very nicely worded sentence.
Yeah, and of course, writing about Pete was the setup for writing about Ringo. And I would say, one thing that I, as a drummer, that it's funny when this doesn't happen anymore very much, but at the time, um, in the 60s and in the 70s particularly, there was an idea of what good drumming was that was somewhat to someone like me, to a drummer, was somewhat misguided. People tended to think of drummers like, let's say, Ginger Baker, um, flashy drummers who tended to play a lot of drums. I mean, literally, kits big kits, and all of this sort of thing. And but who tended to play a lot, it would be the simplest way to describe it. And that became sort of in the eyes of, and God knows when when the heavy metal era came in. I mean, almost all of those drummers were in one way or another in that mode. They played these enormous drum kits. They flailed, and by the way, there were some great flailers in rock and roll. I would describe Keith Moon as one of the premier flailers of our time. And I have a very high opinion of him, but you know what I'm talking about. So people tend to say, it, almost in a kind of like not a grudging way, but in a kind of sort of cautious way. So, what do you think about Ringo as a drummer? And what I thought about Ringo as a drummer was what most um, uh, accomplished drummers thought about Ringo, which was he was a great drummer. He was the perfect drummer for that band, which is the best thing you can possibly be. The analog in jazz would probably be Sonny Greer, who played in Duke Ellington's band for all through the 1930s and into the 40s. Sonny too was not a technically gifted drummer, but he was the perfect drummer for the Duke. He was the perfect drummer for the best big band in the world at that time, right?
Mhm.
And that's sort of what Ringo was in that sense. He was the perfect drummer for the best rock group in the world at that time. And what more would you want than that? And the truth is, when you get into the nuances of his playing, there are a lot of nuances there. There are a lot of different places that he went stylistically, and he also very much kept up on what was going on in drumming, or in rhythm, I would say, in grooves, over the course of that band. So I have a very high opinion of him. And my slightly snarky statement about Pete Best is sort of the setup for that, I guess.
Yeah, and I never would have known Ringo was studying any drumming or really was paying attention to what was going on around him because he never would let on that. And
No.
but I'm glad to hear you say that because you get the way some of the histories have been written is that well Ringo was told what to do and nobody told him really how to play. I mean, you can't do that. He was, in my estimation of the four players, he was the most important player. The others kind of
Mhm.
moved around on different instruments. It was all about the song and how they served
Yes.
the song. Ringo's drumming certainly served the song, but he was the constant and he helped hold that together in a way very few drummers could have. Charlie Watts could not have played in that band successfully. He
No,
would have
that's
sounded
true.
he would have sounded
Yeah.
like Pete Best, and that's not a
Yeah.
rip on Watts or Best. It just that's stylistically the nuances you speak of really fit with the Beatles because their music and their writing is very nuanced.
And Ringo had this interesting sort of quirk as a drummer, which is that which he's never really explained in any particular way, but he tended to start all of most drummers lead with their strong hand, and Ringo is right-handed and plays the drums right-handed, but he had this quirk of starting most of his fills with his left hand, which is something that someone like me spent years learning how to do,
Really? Well, Ringo
essentially.
Ringo is left-handed.
Is he left? Is he
He is
actually left?
left-handed.
Oh,
He
okay.
is,
So he's
and he
played.
would kind of reverse them. I think he would start them like from the other direction or something.
Well,
So he,
what I'm saying is he plays the drums right-handed. Let's say he plays
okay,
the bass drum with his right foot, he plays the snare drum with his left hand, and the cymbals with his right hand.
gotcha.
But in Ringo's case, as I say, he had this. I guess because he is left-handed, he learned to play right-handed, but he would lead on his fills with his left hand. And when you're playing the drums in a right-handed configuration, the interesting thing that does is it makes it much more difficult to do the conventional thing that drummers tend to do, which is to sort of move. I'm going to demonstrate this to move around their set from their snare drum to their tom toms to their floor tom toms. Because if you're leading with this hand, the only way to do that is sort of to cross over or something like that. So what that meant was that Ringo's fills, almost by definition, did not conform to the usual flow that most drummers, that's the first way they learn how to play. And on some songs, it's pretty profound, on a song like Rain, obviously, which is one of his great sort of moments.
Mhm.
Um, those fills are hard to figure out what he's doing. They're not necessarily hard to play, but conceptually, if a right-handed drummer, a conventional drummer is trying to learn how to play them, one thinks, what the hell is going on here exactly? You know?
Yeah, I always kind of referred to his drumming. It had this kind of a drag to it. I don't know if that's because he was playing
Hmm.
on a right-handed kit because he's playing on the back end of the note which
Yeah.
gave the song so much dimension. And I just love that. I mean, and it's hard
Yeah.
to pick up on. And I think that's one of the things that makes the Beatles music so special.
Yes. I would say, and in that regard, I would say that he was a little bit that tendency that he had, which I would agree with for the most part. Not that he always did it, but in that sense, he was a kind of premonition of Levon Helm when Levon came along,
Ah,
because
okay.
Levon taught everybody a whole new way of playing. It's, the musical term is legato. You're sort of playing behind the beat a little bit,
Okay.
except you're not because you're not slowing down and you're not dragging the music. But in terms of where you hit on the beat, you're hitting sort of on the backside of the beat rather than the front of the beat. What's the front of the beat? Listen to Mitch Mitchell. That's the front of the beat.
Okay. Gotcha. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad those are the kind of things that you sprinkle into the book, and it's really nice to have that background. It just feels because I know there's so many musicians that are fans of the Beatles and read about the Beatles, and they don't get musicians talking about them that much, especially in
Mhm.
a biography sense. And it's really important, I think, to understand that. I've got one other thing I wanted to just I had highlighted here another part of your book in regard to Ringo, and talks a little bit about Pete Best because strangely enough, you get this argument to this day about Pete Best being a good drummer. Not that he was a bad drummer, but usually the people that take the Pete Best side are not musicians. And there's even some writers out there, one in particular that will remain nameless, at least now he may not remain nameless in the future with me, but he seems to have a desire to push forward that Pete was a better drummer than he was. Now, that's kind of hard to do, but let me just read what you wrote here that puts it in very good perspective. Quote, like all beat drummers in Liverpool, Starr played loud and hard, but whereas Pete Best tended to keep time with pounding quarter notes on his bass drum, Ringo had learned to distribute the weight of his playing among cymbals, bass, and snare. However much an element of personal jealousy may have figured in the Beatles' decision to change drummers, there was no question as to who was the better player of the two. So that's a nice little piece of evidence you bring in with the distribution of the weight, which again, that's that nuance we talked about, as opposed to just banging away in a club, which is needed at times, and which Pete did
Sure.
very well. And I don't not to take anything away from him because he was able to bring that Adam beat to this club scene. When the by the way, when the Beatles were not good players either, they were also
Mhm.
learning on their instruments. So that kind of worked at the time, but the other three basically outgrew Pete Best.
Yep. I would definitely agree with that. That's, it's interesting that, I mean, one of the things that's hard when you're writing about, especially very well-known people, and most of the people that I write about are very well known. There's a certain natural desire always to take some kind of a contrarian view to whatever the received wisdom is, right? So in the case of this, to uh, second guess the decision to replace Pete Best with Ringo. Um, Despite the fact that, yes, they had their producer saying that, and making it clear that they had their producer making it clear that if he was to record this band, he was going to use a studio drummer. So, you know, uh, what's so interesting to me about that, by the way, is that we didn't realize it at the time, but the Beatles realized it on some level or another, that they had no intention of being that kind of a popular artist. That is to say, the sort of popular artist who, whatever happens on the record, happens on the record. They didn't think of themselves just as singers or songwriters. They thought of themselves as players, and by that time they were players. Um, Paul McCartney, after all, went on to become one of the three or four most important bassists of the 1960s. And I don't think anybody would dispute that, including some of the other bassists that one might name, which would be James Jamerson and Duck Dunn and so on, and said John Entwistle for that matter. Um, but anyway, it's just very interesting to think that for them, the notion that they would have a studio musician playing on their record was an affront to their whole conception of themselves as a band. Um, And what we have to remember is that conception of a band didn't exist before them. They were the paradigm of a rock group. Before that, musicians, singers were backed up. That was the term that was used by their bands. It was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and Buddy Holly stood in front of the Crickets and sang. And this was not going to be that. This was going to be a line of three people on the stage and one person on a riser above and behind them, but there was no spatial hierarchy there, and there was no musical hierarchy there, and it was critically important to what they went on to do, I think.
I agree. And one of the things that we talked about in preparing for this call was the Beatles obviously had a very good sense of themselves, but they struggled. They didn't want to take themselves too seriously, and that gave them a great freedom in writing their music and in playing, I believe, as well, because they were always just a little bit out in front of everybody, even though they weren't the best players. There were certain
Hmm.
better players out there than all of them. But and you mentioned McCartney. And McCartney, he jumped around on other instruments. George was playing sitar, John played other instruments. So they weren't just committed to one. And,
Right.
jack of all trades, master of none, basically,
Hmm.
except for Ringo. So the trying not to take themselves too seriously did give them that freedom to try new things and to push the boundaries a bit because I don't think they were really comfortable with boundaries.
Well, I know, I think that's true. I mean, and you mentioned their humor, which was integral to who they were as people and to the way that they approached their work. I mean, there's a constant tension in their work of, on the one hand, taking themselves very seriously, and on the other hand, not taking themselves seriously at all. And that tension was constantly there. And that tension is a part of the very much of the culture of Liverpool that they grew up in. Liverpool was the source of comedians in Britain, in British music hall. Liverpool and to a slightly lesser extent Manchester, but the point being, the north of England was and what was the north of England? The north of England was the working class, the great working class sort of district of Britain that saw itself always in relation to the apparent sophistication and the apparent wealth and the apparent snobbery of London.
Mhm.
And so when the Beatles moved their operation from Liverpool to London, they took that attitude with them. In fact, if anything, it became amplified by the fact that they were now surrounded by Southerners, as they would think of it, by Londoners, and they had a marvelous time, just making fun of the all of these posh people as they saw it, and that carried over. I mean, there was a side of John Lennon that never let go of that. When I was writing about Talking Heads, more recently, and writing about the whole phenomenon of the whole influence of art college on British rock and roll in the 1960s, because almost every um, British invasion band of any significance had at least one art student on the team,
Mhm.
as far as that goes. Um, in Lennon's case, um, the main thing he got from art college was this, because he didn't do very well there and he wasn't happy there, and it was this lifelong sort of resentment of the pretension of fine art that, of course, much later on was something that was shared, by the way, by Yoko Ono. It was one of the main things that bonded them. Yoko Ono may have had a desire to be a serious fine artist at one time in her life, but by the time she got to New York and was sort of moving in that downtown New York scene in the 1960s, she was not taken particularly seriously. And as a result of that, she had an enormous chip on her shoulder that she took out in by making art that kind of made fun of what art does. And of course, that was a main theme of performance art in the 1960s. But Lennon shared that with her. Lennon was always sort of felt intimidated and resentful of what we would think of as conventional fine art. McCartney could not have been more different. McCartney was intrigued by that. McCartney was drawn to that sort of dimension of things, you know.
He was the one, the first Beatle actually, that was really taken with Stockhausen and a little more of
Oh, absolutely.
the
Yeah.
actual
Oh,
avant-garde
absolutely.
stuff. That, yeah, it was just one of those things that it was also fashionable to go outside of the convention in the
Of
60s.
course.
So if you were
Yeah.
conventional, you were really very square, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah, it got to be it went in all kinds of different directions. And the Beatles,
Yeah.
while they were the Beatles, they always seemed to keep it together. We've seen some behind the scenes things. We know about Magical Mystery Tour, the film, and we know about the Get Back stuff. And but the veneer still, I don't even want to call it the veneer. The finished product, the music, still
Mhm.
is top notch. You can't you They weren't able to really screw any of that part up.
No, I mean, listen, tension is one of the elements of good music. Um, and the idea is to get it into the music and not have it at the same time not have the fingerprints of it all over the music. And so, you know, the interesting, when Richard Lester first encountered them, and Lester was looking at them not as so much musicians, but as he was going to make a film with these four characters in it. And I was always very taken by the fact that his statement about them at the beginning, when he first met them, was that they were much more like one another than they were different from one another. And one of the fascinating things that we have all done with them, right? And Lester was the first, or Lester and Alan Owen, who wrote the script, of course. Um, for Hard Day's Night. One of the things that they did that made it possible for us to do what we did with them, when I say us, I mean fans, was to um, somehow make them seem like they were these almost four different astrological signs, that they were four
Yeah,
very different people
the four
who
elements, you know, made
yeah, the
something
four
completely
elements,
different.
exactly.
Yeah,
And in truth, so, let me put it this way. Adults with aesthetic training who encountered them didn't have that reaction to them at all. George Martin didn't have that reaction to them either. It wasn't like, oh my God, look at these disparate people here. I wonder how they keep this together. They were much more like one another than they were different from one another. And as time went on, as any group of people will, those differences became amplified almost on an aesthetic level because it was useful to do that. It was useful for Lennon to play the hard man and for Paul to play the soft man, except how many people to this day want to believe that it's John singing Helter Skelter. A lot is, I will tell you. You
yeah,
know,
that's
I
very true. Hmm.
you know, when I was doing publicity around my book and things like that, people would say, "So, you know, what do you think of John singing on Helter Skelter?" And I would say, "Oh, I think it's absolutely fabulous." Except, have you ever noticed that it's Paul who sings the song, in this way? Because that's Paul doing as good an imitation of John as anybody could possibly do in that way. Of being the hard man, of being that sort of person. So it's interesting that way.
It is interesting to see the things that make them the same. I've always liked that. Up until like 67, they were they were pretty much in lockstep. You know, they were reading similar books, they had similar political beliefs. They they seemed to act as one unit. And
Yeah.
as that kind of I guess it was kind of natural for them to grow out of that a little bit. I think you mentioned the way the history is told that they're much more different than they really are,
Yeah,
which I don't know that that's true because how could they have been in a band together and had that kind
of
of
course.
success if they were that different? It doesn't really make sense. So there had to be more things holding them together, tying their ideas together than tearing them apart.
Listen, the other thing about it that's was a huge influence on that is that is sort of the simple explanation in some ways of what happened to their cohesion. Anybody who's ever had the experience of touring on any level with a rock group or any other group of people for that matter, any other performing group, understands that uh, when you're moving through the world doing this thing from place to place, there's this natural kind of sense that you get. You're this little bubble of people, and the social cohesion that comes from that, unless it doesn't. And of course, there are celebrated examples of this not happening. But for lack of a better term, the sense of solidarity that comes from of touring together in that way. That was their experience from really, their first trip to Hamburg through certainly 1965, 60, 66. They toured in 66, but not all that much, to be blunt about it. But so, but that had been their experience with one another. That had been the main way they had known one another during the entire sort of their entire sort of ascension to this kind of fame.
Mhm.
And it has an enormously it ties you together. And so then, as we all know, they stopped doing that. And the first thing that they did when they stopped doing that may, in some ways, be the high point of their collaboration. Um, the things that went on that produced Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and Sergeant Pepper that year, or that half year, really, um, is just one of the most amazing sorts of instances of collaborative work that we have. Not that they weren't collaborative before that, but there was, Revolver in some ways was a deliberate attempt to sort of separate them a little bit. That was the first record that came out where there was one ostensibly one lead singer on every song. And as I recall on the record, they actually had their name next to it. This one by George, this one by John, this one by Paul, so on and so forth. And that was a deliberate effort in some ways to differentiate. But then Sergeant Pepper, they're just completely, and particularly John and Paul, are just completely mixed up in one another's business there. And so they were, they sort of did that. But inevitably, when they stopped spending that amount of just physical time with one another, um, and some of that solidarity started to erode, some of that cohesion started to change. And it produced some amazing music. The White Album is extraordinary. And then the attempt to get it back together on Abbey Road is heartbreaking in a way that's to me always just been kind of amazing. I mean, Abbey Road is to this day, as far as I'm concerned, Abbey Road is the greatest last album that any group has ever made. And it's been 70 years now in that sense,
Yeah,
right? Or
usually
whatever.
by the time you get to the last album, things are not going well, and usually people's last
Exactly.
albums are not very
Right.
good.
And in their case, they were able to they were able to pull it together with great effort. So that's an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, I think you put it really well when you talk about them stopping touring. Really, the only reason they were together at all was because they played in a band. It
Sure.
never really occurred to me until you just said it that when they quit touring in '66, that was kind of, well, the end of the band, kind of. I mean,
Yeah.
what was the reason
Of,
for them to be together? All you did
yeah.
was play live. So,
Yes.
and I think that is a very interesting way to put it because I did a video some time back, took a couple parts to just go through the reasons the Beatles broke up, and I think I came up with 10. And the not touring was one of them. But I didn't quite put it that way. But there certainly was, when you are touring, whether you're on stage in Hamburg or in some small club and not many people are there, or you're at Shea Stadium, there's this us against them feeling. It's like
Absolutely.
us against
Yeah.
the world.
Yes.
So once you remove that, it's just us, and we're not really against the world because we're not up against anybody.
Yeah.
And even look at what the Beatles did. when they did play their last thing together, which was during the Let It Be Get Back stuff, they
Sure.
perched themselves at the top of a big building where nobody could
Yeah.
get near them. And I
Yeah.
think that's
No,
very
absolutely.
telling.
Yeah. Absolutely. After entertaining all of these grandiose ideas about what they might do, right? All of which were pretty inconceivable to them, as a ship, an amphitheater in North Africa or whatever the hell it was, all of these these sorts
The sun
of
coming up on the middle eight or whatever.
yes, right,
It's like,
exactly. This sort of thing. Yeah,
and you said it earlier, the taking themselves too seriously, which they were with these extravagant locations for this final concert. And what did they
sure.
end up doing? Something, the simplest thing
Let's
that
go
was
up on the roof.
perfect. It was
Yeah,
absolutely perfect.
yeah,
So yeah, they had just every part of their. It's so strange. Every part of every turn they took, you could say something like that, or something. Man, that's just perfect. And they were just
yeah.
making it up. They didn't know. They really
Yes,
didn't know. They were
yeah,
trying to do something great, but they tried to keep moving on, and I think that restlessness kept them not taking themselves that seriously, so they could move on.
yeah. One looks back on it, and often people say, well, listen, in the 1960s, we never imagined, at least I certainly never imagined, and I can't imagine anybody that I knew ever imagined that some of these bands would continue playing together for another 50 years. I'm thinking of the Stones. I'm thinking of the Who. That people in them would die, and that but they would just keep going. This sort of thing. Um, whatever our sense of the world was, in my sense of the world anyway, in my 20s or teens or 20s or sort of thing, that was just out of the question. And of course, there's this great statement that John Lennon made that I wound up quoting in my Talking Heads book because uh, he said it, I think, to Michael Braun who wrote that great book about them in 1964. It was the first
Mm-hmm.
serious reporting about the Beatles, and I
Yes, that's
think
a
it was
great book.
him.
Love Me Do,
It's a
right?
it's a great book. I can remember at the time that I wrote my Beatles book, by the way, I had to travel to the library in Amherst, Massachusetts, at Amherst College in Massachusetts, because the only two copies of that book that were available in a library, it was long out of print. The only two copies of that book that were available, one was in Amherst and one was somewhere on the West Coast. So I literally drove up to Amherst and more or less Xeroxed the book while I was there. They didn't quite understand that's what I was doing because that's kind of not what you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, it's a short book. But anyway, in that book, John Lennon, I think it's in that book, John Lennon says something about how, this isn't show business. Whatever's going on here with Beatlemania and all of that, he said, this isn't show business. This is something else. You don't do this and go on. You do this and it's over, or something along those lines, right? Um, well, actually, and I understand exactly what he was thinking, which was that there was something so extraordinary about being as a part of this kind of a musical phenomenon or a cultural phenomenon that you don't go on from this. But of course, what we all learned is that's not true. In the 1970s, rock and roll, rock music became very much a branch of show business as it's conventionally thought of in that way. And in fact, in the 1970s, it became just about the biggest branch of show business in terms of the amount of revenue that it was creating. I mean, the recording industry. Which until then had been this kind of stepchild of Broadway and Hollywood and Tin Pan Alley and that sort of thing. But that all changed in the 1970s. But so in the 1970s, we learned that actually whatever rock wanted to think about itself, it was very much a branch of show business. And given the amount of money that was involved here, as often happens, yes, this was something bands would go on and on and on and on. Now, what's really interesting to me too is how few of those bands, despite all of the musical talent in them, when was the last time the Stones made a really, really great album, for example?
Really, really great. Well,
Yeah. An
I
album
would
that's comparable,
say,
an album that's comparable to, let me name them, Beggar's Banquet, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. Well, it's been a long time.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. The
Ghost
same with The
isn't
Who.
quite as good as Exile, and
No, you know what I'm saying.
yeah,
In the and they put
very
out
tough.
what, 20 albums in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. I don't know how many they are. The same with The Who. Pete Townsend is an extraordinarily gifted musician in terms of his conception of things and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting to me is the way in which something about the nature of group rock and roll, of rock groups, right? Not popular music in general, but of rock groups, s- there seems to be sort of there's a little bit of an expiration date on these bands, whether they want to admit it or not.
Almost
And
certainly.
I don't, that's something that would be interesting to really think about. I don't have a particular theory about it, or a theory that isn't glib about it,
Mhm.
because I think it deserves something more than a glib theory about why this should be so. I was talking to somebody the other day about how we were talking about 1975. This is not on the subject of Beatles, but in 1975, Bob Dylan put out Blood on the Tracks. And I can remember buying that record, taking it home, listening to it, and thinking to myself, the writing on this record is as good as the writing in any collection of short stories I have ever read. That is to say, the literary dimension of that record. And I thought, what this suggests is that anything can happen in popular music. And I expected somehow or another in 1975 for whatever was represented by that record to just keep blossoming in some ways.
Mhm.
Uh-uh. It was actually the end of something. It wasn't the beginning of something. It was the end of something for Dylan. It's not that he hasn't written great songs since then. He's written a number of great songs since then, but he hasn't written an album of songs that good since then, and he never will,
Right.
because there's something, what can you say about it? It's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I can't think of any 60s artists that had anything on the level of Blood on the Tracks after 1975. And one of the things I've been talking about in terms of pop music, and obviously every band has their time. It's a
Mhm.
small window for some of them. We're talking like 18 months, maybe 4 years, 5 years, that's on the outside. But most people write their best material before they're 35.
Yeah,
So these guys, 1975, they'd be
they're getting there.
35-ish or so. They're
Yeah.
right in there. By the time they're in their 40s, I mean, they've just completely just can't write hits much past, their early 40s. And
Yes.
you can't find them. That the history bears that out. Some people
Yeah.
would like to say that it's all radio programmers keeping the old guys down. Nothing can keep a good song down. If people want to hear
Yeah.
it, they will ask for it. They request it, and it breaks. So there is something about youth with popular music that is the fountain of the artistic statements comes from the youth and the
No,
naivety.
it's absolutely.
So I
And it's
think that's very
fascinating.
interesting.
It's not true of painters. In fact, just the opposite, if anything, is true of painters. Um, fine art painters. It's not particularly true of uh, avant-garde or classical composers. I mean, and it's not true of writers, in the sense of, yes, some writers do produce something quite extraordinary in their 20s or early 30s, but most of them do their best work, as you might expect, after they've been doing it for 20 years or so. It's a very interesting thing about popular music in that regard. Now, it's not true of singers. That's a different story. Um, there are singers who come to us in their 40s, even older than that. It's not that they weren't singing, but we become aware of them, at an older age, and it's a different thing. It has to do with this sensibility of, it has to do with the synthesis of singing and writing and playing that is represented by rock groups or by pop groups in that way, which is a very, pretty unique thing. It was not the case for until it was the case.
And the excesses of the 70s really made for short lifespans of rock bands
Yes.
because I mean the
Yes.
lifestyle
Well, that
just
was a
wasn't
whole other
sustainable.
thing.
And
Sure.
that started, I guess that would have started in the 60s, but people don't really talk about how it took its toll. But there was always enough people to replenish, to keep coming up new after every few
Yeah.
years. But then it kind of just burned out and ate itself, I guess.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And now another thing that relates a little bit to this that I hadn't even I didn't even think about, or not even, I didn't think about at the time, but in writing about Talking Heads, I've gotten out of the 60s. I'm writing about the late 70s and 80s. I'm really moving up in the chronology of the world. But one of the things that I wound up writing about, because my book is very much about New York and about the, the music scene and the cultural milieu of New York in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the murder of John Lennon. In uh, and which there were a series of things that happened together, not just from a New York point of view, but especially from a New York point of view. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States in November 1980. John Lennon was murdered in December 1980. And as it happens, the first New Yorker known to have die of AIDS died of AIDS in December 1980 also. That was sort of the beginning of the 80s, a year late, so to speak, in New York City, but or in New York City and in some ways in the country. But one of the things that I didn't think about at the time was that all through the 1970s, while people like me and people like you and many of us were following what the Beatles were doing as solo artists, right? Um, because we hadn't thought much about the idea of these things continuing, it was really in the 1970s that we sort of got the idea that, well, the Stones weren't going to break up. They were going to keep making records, and the Who weren't going to break up, even if Keith Moon died, and so on and so forth. There was a longevity to these rock groups. Um, all through the 1970s, there was in the back of everybody's mind a sense that at some point, at the right time, in the right circumstances, there was a real chance that the Beatles might get back together. And my God, what would that be like, right? And that's what that's what ended in December 1980 was any chance of that, any prospect of that. And it had a very profound effect without, I think, most of us realizing it. That reunion um, uh, was not going to happen. That no matter what else the future of popular music held in store, that was not going to be part of it. I don't mean they would have gotten back together and made 10 albums together. I mean they would have gotten back together and made a record together. And I think it would have been rather extraordinary. I think they would have done it. I think somehow or another the circumstances would have brought it about. And I think it would have been quite amazing in that sense.
Mhm.
Um, so that's an interesting prospect when we talk about the longevity of these groups and so on.
So I think you had referred to that as, the Lennon assassination as the true death of the Beatles because
Yeah,
of, I think that's, and they even call it the death of the 60s, really. It really,
yes,
the nail was put in the coffin with Lennon's assassination, which I think makes sense.
yeah. It's funny, I referred to it as his murder, and of course it was his murder, but it was also an assassination, and just what a bizarre um, concept that term, which has a very particular sort of significance to it, um, was suddenly applicable to a musician, a rock musician. That is, after all, who he was in that sense. Um, Plenty of musicians had been murdered, some of them quite prominent, right? In
True.
that sense. Nobody talks about the assassination of Sam Cooke, for example.
Right,
No, you know what I'm saying. But
right.
this was an assassination because uh, we didn't have any other way of really processing it in that sense.
Yeah,
It's fascinating to me
it
that
is an
way.
interesting choice of words, and it
Yeah,
gets
yeah,
used for that in particular, and
yeah,
just to show you how big they were.
yeah.
almost could have started a war, you know. I mean,
Well,
drama going
yes,
around.
if it had been the wrong person who did it, as opposed to and listen, I mean, the other part of it that's so compelling, which is that all of us who on one level or another were fans of the Beatles, and this is something that I struggled with a lot because as a professional musician, I always wanted to think that my relationship to the Beatles was that they were musical heroes to me, right? The idea that they were culture heroes to me was somehow, because of my own snobbery, I would say, a little disquieting. I wanted to think of them as well, I'm a musician, they're musicians, and they're musical heroes of mine in that sense. But on some level or another, they loom so large in many of our sort of concept of the world, that yes, they were something much more than just musical heroes. They were cultural icons. And of course, the interesting thing about that is it's one thing to be a cultural icon. It's another thing to be one-fourth of a cultural icon.
That's true.
And and
Very
and to,
true.
and to go through your life, I mean, I think about, whatever it was for us, and for well, at that time, the other three, but then George's death, its effect on the remaining two, and I suppose that someday we will have one of them left, and in that way, and just what this must have, what the effect on them was in that sense is almost unimaginable. I've always been an enormous admirer of Paul, the album that Paul put out when that he was making when John was killed, Tug of War, because there are three or four songs on that record that just I find just absolutely heartbreaking and marvelous, and on a level of his work with the Beatles, I guess I would say in that sense, because on an emotional level, they rise to that.
Well, here we are in 2025, and we're getting very close to the end for our two remaining Beatles.
Yeah.
Three, if you include Pete Best. He's still an original Beatle, you know.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And so it's I'm trying to understand where the Beatles' legacy is going. One things I do like is there's a lot of writers really zeroing in on certain aspects of their career
Sure.
that I think is making for a much richer legacy.
Hmm.
And part of what I do, and I have to mingle with a lot of people that buy the stuff that gets put out. This product merchandise. Where
Sure.
is this all going? Because people seem to be it's still being sold, it still sells, not in the
Hmm.
numbers it used to. And I think people don't realize that what a big dip in sales has been taken with the Beatles in many ways, because there's
Uh-huh.
so much social media, and we all gravitate to what we like within the social media. So there's this false sense of popularity. So I'm trying
Right.
to understand, where is this all going in the next 10 years? And
Yeah.
does it just fizzle out? Does it become something more of a niche? I don't know. Any
It's
comments from
it's
you?
very hard to say. I mean, I haven't read it, but I know there's a new book out called John and Paul that's being extensively reviewed and so on and so forth in terms of focusing in on one aspect of them, which is that relationship, which was, after all, a big part of it all in that way. Um, Listen, to me, the whole that they continue to have is, and again, I don't know in terms of people's desire to necessarily um, participate in the iconography of the group, which relates to things like merchandising and stuff like that. But the hold that they continue to have on the popular imagination is sort of amazing. And those of us who have children who are now adults, and I don't have grandchildren yet, but I know a lot of people who do, there's this constant sort of rediscovery of them, um, but generation after generation. And initially, supposedly, uh, I mean, and there's always a certain backlash too. Supposedly, the original bass player in the Sex Pistols I'm blanking on his name, but supposedly he was fired from the band and because of his love of the Beatles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the idea that punk was, felt a need to sort of like, stand in defiance of whatever the Beatles represented in that way. To me, uh, after writing about the Beatles, I wrote about Otis. That's the whole world of R&B and soul music was a very different thing in some ways than what the Beatles certainly what they came up in and what they represented. In writing about Talking Heads, I've had an opportunity to write again about the phenomenon of a rock group. Okay, and what it's sharpened in my mind is again how much the Beatles really were the paradigm of what a rock group was. Maybe it was in an earlier conversation. I expressed my strong opinion that the photographs that Ingrid took of not Ingrid, Astrid took of them in Hamburg when they first got there, when Stu Sutcliffe was still in the band, that whole business of posing them, where the in that way and everything. To me, every picture of a rock group since then has been a variation on Astrid's theme. In other words, she put them together, she photographed them. They were doing whatever they thought they were doing. They were 18 and 19 and 20-year-old kids being asked by an attractive German woman to stand there and like this. So they were engaged in whatever fantasy was going on in their heads. But the level of kind of casual solidarity that's expressed in the best of those photographs. Um, every picture of a rock group since then has been some variation on that, right? And one can say the same thing about certain aspects of the music too, with this one extraordinary exception, which is if they were the model for this whole thing, they were also, and I would say this pretty strongly, um, they were also the first, they were also really the only rock group that contained, this has to be taken all together, two of the greatest singers and two of the greatest songwriters of their generation in the same band. And then what do you know? Um, I think there's a case to be made that a third of another of them went on to become, if not one of the great, well, yeah, I would say maybe one of the greatest songwriters of his generation in terms of George Harrison's late Beatles work and work as a solo artist. Now we can talk about other groups. We can talk, I mean, the band had three of the greatest singers of its generation in the same group too, but not two of the greatest songwriters. The idea that the original model of this thing had that kind of a concentration of talent, in some ways has been an inspiration, and in other ways it's been a kind of an intimidation for every rock group since. And I,
Yeah,
I can't really see it any other way.
yeah, intimidation is a good way to put it, and it's almost
Yeah,
like it's not reachable,
yeah. Well,
and
it's
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 almost
sort
like
of not.
people have resigned themselves to say, well, this is the gold standard by which nothing can be greater, almost.
Yeah,
And that came
yeah.
about rather early. I mean, I remember the days where I still can remember talk of, well, the next Beatles. Well, that kind of
Mhm.
stopped after a while. I mean, I haven't heard
Yeah,
that in a long time. Nobody
yeah,
talks about that anymore. And I think they realize that it's futile.
yeah. Exactly. Well, there was the next Beatles. There was the next Dylan. You know,
Yeah, yes,
there was the next.
next Stones.
Yeah, the next Stones. The funny thing, I don't remember anybody ever talking about the next Hendrix, and that's kind of interesting because again, there was, one of the things that um, when one works in the music business as I did, um, you have a very we all have a very complicated relationship with the idea of this thing that we call talent. Okay? Because what everybody knows is that talent by itself is doesn't really amount to very much. Because without determination and without imagination and inspiration, and I would add one other thing, which is extraordinary good luck, which almost everybody that you and I know about in the music business has had in one way or another, or else we wouldn't know about them, right? In that sense. Um, without all of those things, talent by itself doesn't really amount to much. But there is a thing called talent, and one knows it when one sees it, right? And when one encounters somebody like Lennon or McCartney or Dylan or Hendrix or a lot of other people, I don't want to sound like an old fart here because it goes on and on in regard to that. Um, uh, it's a real thing. And while all of those other things are essential, nobody ever made great, great music just on the basis of determination and imagination and good luck. There had to be real talent there. And in the case of the Beatles, it was this remarkable concentration of talent. And that's that's an intimidation. It really is.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to put into words, but you did it better than most in your biography, Can't Buy Me Love.
Well,
So,
I appreciate that. I may have said this to you before, but my favorite statement about the Beatles was one that Ned Rorem made. Ned Rorem was a modern classical composer
hmm,
who went on to wrote some wonderful art songs, as they call them, which I don't really know what the difference between art songs and regular songs is, but I guess if you're a classical composer and you write songs, there are art songs in this way. But in I think it was the fall or maybe January of maybe January 1968, I think it was. Um, he wrote a piece in Life magazine about the Beatles, right? And the idea was, oh, here this classical composer. This was after Sergeant Pepper. It was mainly focused on Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. Here, this classical composer is going to give his imprimatur of to the quality of the Beatles' music, which was still an unusual thing at that time for people to talk. I mean, Leonard Bernstein was starting to talk about them. Anyway, in this article that he wrote in Life magazine, Ned Rorem made the simple statement. He said, "The Beatles are good, even though everybody already knows that they're good." And I've always just loved that statement because
oh,
it shows the way that they defied connoisseurship in a certain way. We all want to think that the things that we think are good are these special things over here. Well, here's this thing that everybody thought was good. Everybody knew was good, and it was good. It was that good in that sense, and that's kind of an amazing thing. That's a kind of simple. This is a kind of interestingly oversimplified explanation of why they did what they were able to do.
well, that was a great quote. I had not known about that one, so
I
thank you for
love it.
sharing that one.
My favorite quote about them.
Oh, there's so many, and I should put a book together of just great quotes on the
Yes,
Beatles. There's
yeah,
an idea
yeah.
for me
There
for
you
another
go.
project.
There you go. That's an idea.
Yeah. All right, Jonathan. Well, thank you. I think we'll end on that note. It's a great note to end on,
Wonderful.
and I really appreciate you joining me today because I love talking Beatles, and people that watch this channel love hearing people talk about the Beatles. So I think this
Well, I
was
appreciate it. Again, I've had my head wrapped up in talking heads for the last 4 years, which is what happens when you write a book about somebody else. But it's wonderful to sort of like step out of that now that that book is done and coming out, and think about this stuff, revisit some of these thoughts that I haven't necessarily had at front of mind for all of this time. So that's great. I'm very grateful for this.
well on my list is the Otis Redding book to go into next. I've got the Talking Heads book here, which I'm very anxious to see and read about the scene because it's always so fascinating to understand what scenes produced. And the
Yeah,
Beatles were part of like two scenes, really, kind of a Hamburg scene that was not, but more, which was actually more touristy than the Liverpool
right.
scene. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I expect to see something similar in New York with
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Chris Franz said at one point, he said when he first saw the place, he said about CBGB's, he said this could be like our Cavern Club,
okay,
and
there you
he
go.
wasn't totally wrong about that. It's there were interesting analogies between the two, but that's a topic for another day.
Topic for another video. Okay, everybody,
Okay,
I'm gonna put links down below if you're gonna check out these books, and we'll get you over
wonderful.
there. We'll get you all set up, and yeah, thanks again for joining me. And I'd like to have you back again sometime. There's always going to be topics
I'd
on
be
the
delighted
Beatles.
to do that.
Yeah, we'll always have things to talk about when it comes to the Beatles. So thanks for
Excellent.
joining me.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure.